Thanks everyone for tuning in. And tonight we have Claudia Chiffon. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but she's an MD and PhD in sociology and philosophy. And she's also an associate professor of health policy and global health at York University in Canada. She's also past US Fulbright Scholar, past graduate program director in health, and current special advisor to the Dean of Faculty of Health and Curriculum Internationalization. She is retired from medical practice in her native Argentina. Claudia works in the tradition of Marxist critical social health policy and discourse studies. Her research includes comparative health policy, the geopolitical economy of global health, and medicalization and social control. She's currently researching the geopolitics of anti-Asian racism in times of COVID-19, the politics of sanctions policy, and moral panic in the COVID-19 pandemic. Claudia is editorial board member of leading journals in her field. She has published widely in journals such as Social Science and Medicine, Critical Public Health, and the International Journal of Health Services. And she's actively involved with organizations working on anti-war, anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist struggles. So we have a really good mix of skill sets. And from here, Claudia, please go ahead. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for taking time on a Monday evening. I hope that the things I'll share with you that I believe are not terribly new to anyone here will give you some insight on some of the issues that are happening in academia that, as I can gather, at least the students are quite aware of. But I'll give you hopefully some articulation of these issues, and also a little bit of confidence that, frankly, when you go out and talk to others, about your own perspective as well. So, Sarah, can I go ahead and share the screen? And hopefully we will be able to. So just to be very frank, my presentation that I've entitled "You're Not a Horse," following a Twitter that some of you may be familiar with, was also a presentation that I gave on a recent conference. It was a national conference called Congress, that some of you may be familiar with, people who are in the field of, social sciences, the humanities, and so forth. People from all over the country, gather and, discuss issues of all sorts. And I was actually quite surprised that my COVID presentation would have even been accepted, because it's not part of the dominant narrative, even of the sort of, I would call sort of the left, presumably critical, narrative in academia, but it was. And anyway, so I decided to do kind of an adaptation of that because I thought that, I'm interested, I'm doing the work. I'm really honored to be here and to as a member of CCCA, and Sarah, thank you for inviting me. And as I usually do when I'm teaching, Sarah already mentioned way more about myself than that is necessary, so I'll just skip that. I wanted to ask a few questions to begin my presentation, just with a yes or no show of hands, as we all do sort of electronically. I wanted to ask people if you've ever heard that people who voice views opposing official COVID views, like mandated vaccinations or masks or school closures, are accused of spreading misinformation. Is that part of your experience? Or you've maybe voiced that view and you say, well, this is misinformation. Have you ever been accused of that? You can have a show of hands. I can't see people, so Sarah, you'll let me know. Okay, everyone raising their hands. Okay, well, I'm with you. Right. How about vaccine hesitancy? Have you ever heard of people called vaccine hesitant because they ask questions about the safety and effectiveness of COVID vaccines, even if they have in the past have accepted vaccines of other sorts, or even a COVID vaccine, but maybe they're hesitant, they're doubting, saying, okay, do I really need a second or a third or a fourth or a fifth, right? Have you ever heard that concept, vaccine hesitancy, used that way?
Yeah, we're seeing again a lot of hands.
So it looks like several of us. And what about anti-vaxxers? Have you ever, or people who question the need for not vaccines, but COVID vaccines, called anti-vaxxers and this being used as a term of abuse. Have you had that experience?
Yeah, lots of hands.
Okay, so we obviously agree a lot, but anyway, so let me give you a little bit of context to one of the projects that I'm involved with. I'm involved in a few, but anyway, a little bit of context. You may all be aware, although I was presenting this just so that you know, to an audience of people who are, largely not necessarily paying attention to this, right? So on August 21st of 2021, the US Food and Drug Administration tweeted, "You're not a horse." So what were they trying to do? Well, it was a call to a rising number of Americans consuming ivermectin to protect themselves from COVID-19 to stop doing that. Now, the FDA argued that ivermectin, initially developed as an anti-parasitic drug for animals for veterinary use, including but not only horses, was not only ineffective but also dangerous when used to prevent or treat COVID. And the challenges to this claim was health misinformation. So welcome to officially the concept of misinformation, supported by major health institutions. Now, around that same summer, 2021, the World Health Organization, major health institution, authority, was reporting on the threats to global health posed by misinformation on COVID vaccines. And this threat was leading to vaccine hesitancy. There you go. According to the WHO, vaccine hesitancy is one of the 10 top threats to global health, right? Alongside, say, poverty, hunger, vaccine hesitancy. Meanwhile, the US Surgeon General, another top health authority, was warning that misinformation was undermining public trust on COVID vaccines that had been granted, as you probably are aware of, emergency use authorization by the FDA the prior year. Now, around that time, major media outlets like The Guardian in the UK, Globe and Mail in Canada were warning about a pandemic of the unvaccinated, with unvaccinated COVID patients overwhelming health services and occupying all available ICU beds. Now, with my own share of, several decades of chronic health conditions, my own, and a decade-long career in medicine in Argentina, my country of origin, before switching to one in sociology and public health. I'm sorry, not public health, but public policy. And I think of myself as a critical public policy, right? Upon immigrating to North America, the health data was conveying a strikingly different message about vaccines. According to our world in data, as vaccination rates increased, as you can see in the graph, generally in wealthy countries, so did COVID-19 cases. They increased. More vaccines, more COVID cases. Whereas generally in poor countries, notably the African continent, vaccination rates and cases remained flat. Now, as a peer-reviewed study in the European Journal of Epidemiology at the time was conducted, showed that of 68 countries and about 3,000 US counties, there was no correlation between COVID vaccination rates and cases. And this study confirmed my observation of the data that I was following in our world in data. And this wasn't an isolated observation. A lot of people, as I found out later on, were doing the same observation. In fact, if you look at this line, the sort of the best fit in the data, you can see that there's a slightly positive correlation showing that as vaccination rates increase in the world, so do COVID cases. Official data from the UA around that same time, it was the summer of 2021, indicated that the highest percentage of ICU beds were not COVID, but non-COVID. And that among 20% of ICU beds, they call them critical care beds in the UK, remained empty. Now, what about Canada? Well, in Canada, the pattern was similar, with data showing that non-COVID patients occupied most of the acute care beds, as you can see in the graph, these are fully vaccinated. And acute care beds, 20% of which remained empty throughout 2021. In fact, through now, pretty much through now. So since the very beginning, there was no such thing as ICU beds being just taken over, much less by COVID patients. A few months later, as authorities recommended boosters to prepare us for the winter, that was last year, official data showed cases skyrocketing among the boosted, notably the age group of university students right here. I was thinking that the kids who are showing up were going to be 17, 16. But anyway, if you're in this group, at least a few of us, not me, you see that the more boosted, the higher the cases. Now they're kind of dropping down again. Actually, right now, I can't say it because since June, early June, it looks like Public Health Ontario decided that they don't have to share this data anymore with us. So I actually cannot access the data, the web site where I got the data until the end of May, early June. Now, official data also showed that since early in 2020, COVID disease and death has been highly concentrated on the sick and the elderly, with Canada displaying the largest percentage of death among institutionalized population in wealthy countries. If we look at this other distribution, particularly, you see that in Canada, most of the deaths, in fact, majority of the deaths, clustering people who are actually older than life expectancy in Canada, where the COVID deaths are occurring. Now, another revealing observation, this is as I was waking up to this whole, what would I call it? This whole narrative, this whole story, right? Or this whole crisis. Another revealing observation was that how COVID hospitalizations and deaths were operationally defined. In other words, how do you recognize a COVID death when you see it? Well, as it turns out, a positive PCR test has been enough to register as COVID anyone hospitalized and dying of, say, congestive heart failure. So somebody experiences congestive heart failure, ends up at the hospital. With a PCR positive test, they call it a COVID hospitalization. The person dies, the patient dies, a COVID death. One notorious case that some of you may be aware of occurred in BC, where the parents of a cancer-stricken child accused provincial health officer Bonnie Henry, I just came from BC, of misrepresenting their child's death as caused by COVID when, on the account of the parents, the child had died of cancer. And when Public Health Ontario recently revised this definition, in other words, they stopped calling anybody with a positive PCR test a COVID patient, right? Particularly they've gone for some other reason. COVID hospitalizations dropped to less than half. In other words, our very authorities admitted that they had been essentially overcounting COVID hospitalizations and deaths. As well, already in 2020, and this is what's probably my first wake-up call to all this, looking at the medical literature had been reporting on many, not just ivermectin, but many off-patent drugs, well-tested safety, repurposed for COVID with excellent results. I'm showing ivermectin because it's been sort of the most in the media and so on. And all these drugs were implemented generally outside of North America, for instance, as I learned over the past couple of years in my own native Argentina. But not in Canada, not in the USA, not in Europe, not in Oceania, namely Australia or New Zealand. Finally, the elephant in the room, where the number of adverse events and deaths have accumulated since the launch of the global vaccination project. So I took this earlier today in preparation for tonight. So you have, as of the past count, probably last Friday, the VAERS reporting system, which is a system where people in the US and some in a little bit outside of the US too, but largely the United States, all the cases of vaccine adverse events are reported, if we look at the totality of adverse events, since this reporting system was created in the 1990s, the early 19, I believe exactly in 1990 or 1992 was launched. The deaths reported after a vaccination, any of the vaccines delivered in the USA, is a total of 38,000 roughly. 29,000 of those deaths have occurred after COVID shots as of today. So that's pretty startling. Now, to summarize the observations I've been making, and as I said, they're really not rocket science, I don't believe particularly new. These are the following: powerful authority messages like COVID kills, you can be next, our hospitals are overwhelmed, but they contrasted with actual data. The data was completely off. So these, these claims are completely off empirical observations. Rushed clinical trials with no risk-benefit analysis. I'm also involved in some research pertaining to that. Moving policy goalposts from 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Well, we all know where that went, right? 2 weeks to flatten the curve to jabs or your job, or your status as a student. Generous funding for vaccine education. Academia is flooded with those, and research for vaccine hesitancy. Full liability protection for big pharma, whose products target the world population from cradle, almost literally now 6 months old, to grave. All this along a very powerful, successful public campaign of othering dissenting voices. And by othering in sociology, we simply mean, us versus them. And they are the crazy ones. They are the ones who are not, are not team players, don't care about others, and so on. These are my observations. So given these observations, my goal has been to identify the use of medical discourse that I happen to know fairly well, given my medical practice, as means of social control in the COVID crisis, and assess their implications for, policy, health, justice, a good society. My research questions were: how are voices that deviate from the official narrative in COVID policy represented? What's the representation? And how do labels, say, for instance, calling someone an anti-vaxxer, perform the ideological work of othering dissent? And then what science informs these mechanisms? Where's the science that these othering discourses uphold to be the real science, right? As opposed to probably what we believe that to be. So I focus on vaccine hesitancy, misinformation, and anti-vaxxer because of the analytic potential of these terms. They're morally charged. We all know that it's not a good thing to be vaccine hesitant. We've got a problem, right? Certainly not an anti-vaxxer who wants to be called that, right? It's a term of abuse, and misinformation is a bad thing. In fact, it's almost criminalized behavior these days, right? So they're all decidedly bad terms. Let me say just a word. I don't want to make it like too complicated, but just a word on my sociological. I'm going to put my sociological hat now, my sociology hat now. There was a woman by the name of Laura Natter 50 years ago. She's an anthropologist, a well-known anthropologist, and she encouraged her students at Berkeley in California who were studying social power, say, for instance, corporate power, right? To study those who exercise power rather than those who are afflicted by, the powerful or the abused or the exploited, right? So he said, you got to go look at the powerful folks, what they say, what they think, how they feel, what they do, right? So as a sociologist, since I started looking critically into medicine and medical practice, I've been, kind of doing that. So I chose, for this reason, the Canadian edition of The Conversation. Who is familiar with The Conversation? Who knows anything about this outlet, The Conversation? Can I have a show of hands, maybe? Okay, nobody? Well, that's great. So I have something new to show you. Well, no, one person, Bernard. So are you a professor? Bernard is a professor?
I was a professor
Okay,
here
okay,
with
well,
University of Montreal and also a scientist at the NS.
okay, okay. Thank you, Bernard. Well, once a professor, always a professor. So as it turns out, it's a well-respected academic outlet that describes itself as, and I'm going to quote, an independent source of news and views whose editors believe in the free flow of information. This is why I chose my presentation today. I think they are archetypal of academic propaganda. And I won't define propaganda for now, but we can talk about that if later there's time. I will skip the data selection strategy for the sake of time, but it was systematic, so other people can reproduce it. I used my own judgment to select within a systematic search a few articles to analyze. And I looked specifically to an academic outlet of great respectability to represent academia, the voice of academia. So let me move on to my findings. And again, for the sake of time, I will go directly to my interpretation. This is some of the things I found about vaccine hesitancy, misinformation across several months, the themes that I identified in the discourse of academia, in the words of professors and colleagues, right, of mine. And I will summarize interpretively what I found. Guided by my research question: how are voices othered, and how are dissenting voices othered and represented? So concerning vaccine hesitancy, and I put them in red because it's not a good thing to be vaccine hesitant. You're at least, it's a little bit of a problem. It is defined as delay or refusal to any vaccine, even when available, generally experienced by uneducated and low-income persons with a collective history of experimentation. A few may be educated, but in most cases, actually, I think that the former one is that's the one that I'm talking about. A few may be educated, but in most cases, the hesitant is unduly influenced by misinformation. So it's an influential person. More on this in a minute. And for this reason, they are a threat to themselves and others, although unintentionally. We should listen to them non-judgmentally and help them build trust towards vaccines, and avoid discussing the science with them because they tend to distrust science. Now, this is not my interpretation. This is verbatim my identification of the themes pervading academic discourse. Concerning misinformation, it is false, misleading, devoid of context. It can be even hate speech, and does not conform with scientific consensus. If it is knowingly false, namely the person conveying this information knows it to be false, then it is called disinformation. And it is produced by, guess who? Anti-vaxxers. More on this shortly, right? And what should we do about it? Well, it should be regulated and, if necessary, censored. Now, concerning anti-vaxxers, this is how academia represents anti-vaxxers in their own words. They're a social movement of right-wing, white supremacist, conspiracy theories, and anti-government extremists. They're driven by anger, prone to violence, and hard to change. We can't engage with them. They won't dialogue with us. So we can only hope to neutralize them by building trust with communities and doing what they call media literacy, educating people about the science of vaccines. We can and should counter anti-vax messages by regulating social media, because anti-vaxxers thrive in social media, or we have to ban anti-vaxxers from social media altogether. And all of us know the history of people who've been, whose Twitter accounts have been suspended, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll show a few representative quotations, but just for the sake of time, so we have more time to Q&A, let me offer the gist of my findings. And I'm, again, highlighting the terms in red because they're all considered bad things, right? Vaccine hesitancy is experienced by people who are good. Now, they're not bad people, but they're kind of, ignorant, uninformed, influentiable, and they're also distrusting to some degree of science, sometimes with good reason. Misinformation is, simply put, fake news. And these are quotations from articles written by academics again. And anti-vaxxers are the bad guys that produce the misinformation and disinformation we talked about before. So summing up, this is more of sort of my interpretation based on the observations of academic discourse. On one end of the mental health spectrum of psychopathology, we have vaccine hesitancy, right? These are people influenced by mis or disinformation, fake news in turn produced by, on the other hand, the end of the spectrum, the anti-vaxxers, which is a social movement of individuals driven by wrong, even sinister, this is kind of quotations, right? Morals, politics, or motivations. So they're bad people. And the mechanisms of othering dissent, anybody who disagrees with the dominant narrative, include naming, giving them labels. These are labels sort of made up to signal the other, educating those who are educatable, if possible, like the hesitant, right? Or shaming and neutralizing or even criminalizing, if necessary, those who spread misinformation. Now, the assumption, which is often very explicit, so it's not even an assumption, is that with extremely rare exceptions, the COVID crisis will only end with mass vaccination across age groups, with periodic boosters for the foreseeable future. So a student of mine once said, "Professor, what they're really saying is that they want us to have a lifetime subscription to Pfizer." And I thought that was quite kind of funny to, to conceptualize what's not really a very nice, situation, right? So in my observation of the academic discourse, alternatives to official policy are not only irrational, unscientific, or even evil. They're simply unimaginable. They're unimaginable. If you dare imagine them, you're a crackpot, you're crazy, you need to be locked up, shut down. So why does this matter? Well, I think that the implications of the discourses and practices of in academia, legitimized by these othering mechanisms, the implications for health and human flourishing are not trivial. For one, they give room to the spread of science of dubious quality. For instance, I'm sharing with you, and some of you may have come across it, a recent article in a prestigious journal of the Canadian Medical Association that quickly hit the headlines in Canada, but also beyond, even in South America. And the article, written by very prestigious professors, claimed that the unvaccinated are a threat to the vaccinated. Now, mind you, this wasn't an empirical study, but a mathematical modeling exercise. So you kind of assume certain things, and then you model. It's like a sort of a thought experiment, what might happen. Now, at least two of the assumptions of this model were flatly false, absolutely transparently false. One was that vaccine efficacy of 80% means that of 100 vaccinated individuals, 80 will not contract COVID. This is verbatim from this academic medical journal article. That's a transparently false assumption. Another one that was COVID vaccine immunity lasts forever, which of course is flatly false, because if it were true, then nobody would ever need a booster. So a study that would have flunked a beginning methods course in medical school when I was teaching, or now that I teach health policy, is being used to persuade Canadians, even those who have received already 4 or 5 shots, that their unvaccinated fellow men and women are dangerous to them. And they're also being used to persuade parents that they have to jab their 6-month-old. It is also being used to inform and implement policies of exclusion and criminalization that, in my opinion, are both unscientific and morally unacceptable. So about a century ago, American journalist Sinclair Lewis wrote a book by the name of, that he entitled, "It Cannot Happen Here." He argued, Sinclair Lewis argued that liberal democracies, especially in times of crises, are a fertile soil for totalitarian rule and totalitarian ideology. If promoted to protect the public good, they could be promoted the guise of protecting the public good and using fear to control public opinion and obliterate dissident voices. Now, that country was the USA. The crisis was the Great Depression, and society's enemies at the time were welfare cheats, so people who depended on welfare programs, they were the cheats. Promiscuous women were also the danger to society, and the liberal press was a danger to society. Now, oddly enough, that same liberal press now is enthusiastically engaged in othering dissent to manufacture consent for official COVID policy. So I would like to end by sharing with you that pursuing this kind of critical analysis of academic discourse and medical discourse hasn't been easy, because I'm faced with colleagues who are completely in line with the dominant narrative, and that's not an easy place for me to be. But I find consolation in the words of Mark Twain, who once said that, and I'm quoting, "Whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it is time to pause and reflect," close quote. So Mark Twain and his wisdom keep me going. And that's the end. I'm happy to address questions and challenges or just chat.